Four, three, two, one. You're live.
Welcome to this edition of CyFy 2021 from ORF. The topic for our discussion this afternoon is safety and the internet, protecting children online. This is, of course, an extremely important subject, especially in the last 18 months, as all our lives have been completely consumed by our digital activities and our online activities. Who's watching the kids right now? This is a big question. And it's also interesting, I was telling some of the panelists just before we started the discussion, very timely to have this conversation today for two reasons. One is that a major US children's hospital has released its findings from a survey on online activity of children and parents, and found that at least 50% of parents of children between the ages of 10 and 12 have children who use social media accounts. So the question is, who's regulating their use, who's putting in parental controls, what are they consuming, how safe is it? These are big questions. And the second reason why this is topical is because in the UK, a new online harms bill is being discussed and debated. Also, again, important because in the context of recent findings from Facebook whistleblowers as well about the impact of Instagram, for example, on young teenage girls. These questions again are important, and so we'll kick off our conversation with members from the UK Home Office. Jonathon Allinson is joining us, and Papaleontiou. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'd request one of you actually to kick us off with just telling our viewers right now and people who are joining this conversation the broad contours of the online harms bill. What is Ofcom going to do? Why has it been conceived of in the first place? What do you hope to achieve?
Thank you, Mara, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'll just give a quick summary of the online safety legislation. So the ambition is to make the UK the safest place to be online, to address both illegal harmful content online and also to address some content which is potentially legal but also harmful. And there's a particular focus on the legislation on protecting children online from both illegal and harmful material. So we've published a draft bill which will go through the UK Parliament next year, and the legislation will put a duty of care on companies to protect their users online. Service providers, which will include companies which host user-generated content and which facilitate messaging between users and search services, will have a duty of care which for the first time will give them clear legal responsibilities to understand the risk of harm to their users and to put in place systems and processes to improve user safety. So one of these duties will be around preventing the proliferation of illegal content and activity online, but there'll also be another duty to ensure that children who use their services are not exposed to harmful or inappropriate content. And then the biggest tech companies will also have duties on legal content that may harm adults. The companies will be able to fulfill their duty by taking recommended steps which are set out in codes of practice. The regulator, Ofcom, as you mentioned, will be issuing those codes of practice, and they will also oversee how companies are meeting their duties of care. The companies can either take the steps in the codes of practice or they can take alternative action, provided the outcome is as good or better. And then just quickly, there'll also be requirements on companies to have effective and accessible mechanisms for users to report concerns or to seek redress about harmful content they've seen online. And then there'll also be other duties in the legislation to require the major tech companies to protect journalism or democratic content to avoid the legislation having an undue impact on freedom of expression. So that's just a quick summary of what the legislation does.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. And Christian, maybe I can just ask you to also come in. Jonathan prefaced his remarks by saying that the idea was to make the UK the safest place for children to be online. But in this sort of interconnected digital sphere, which is our new universe, there are no geographies and boundaries that you can actually regulate quite the same way. So, we'll get the lawyers to come in on the issue of jurisdiction in a bit, but maybe you can tell us how the UK has envisioned the jurisdiction. I mean, how can you make the UK the safest place when the platforms are based all over the place?
Thank you, and thank you for taking time to host us today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to address you all in terms of the UK plans in this space. If I may, again, in terms of ensuring that the UK is the safest place to be online, we can legislate domestically. And Johnny has just summarised, if you like, the broad brush approach that we are taking in terms of domestic regulation. I guess the bit that I really wanted to focus on and draw attention to, and just to stress my particular lead within the Home Office and within the UK government, is around child sexual abuse material in particular, which we recognise as one of the most severe or egregious harms that companies need to address alongside terrorist material. And I guess the bit I just want to really emphasise is part of what we are developing in the online safety bill is alongside that framework which Johnny has just outlined, is to really try and provide a bit more clarity for companies around what good looks like in regards to what they should be doing and what they could be doing to make their platforms safe for children in terms of child sexual abuse material. So we have published alongside the online safety bill materials what is called a code of practice, or a draft code of practice on child sexual abuse material, which sets out what good looks like. So it focuses on expectations around what companies should do to identify and take down known material, what they need to do to identify and take down new material, what they need to do around grooming of children, live streaming, how they can work together and cooperate across platforms in order to address the problem, and again, things like the need for transparency to be able to demonstrate how safe their platforms are. Now, the reason I draw attention to that, to come back to your question, is because that is joined with some international work that we're also engaged in. We have, for example, drafted voluntary principles for companies on how they should go about tackling child sexual abuse material, which we have brokered with some of our key international allies. And that is trying to draw, if you like, an international set of expectations on what companies should be doing, which match, if you like, our domestic approach that we're taking. And so those voluntary principles, which were signed at the White House, 18 months ago now, provide a real framework to try and really mobilise companies to take action in the here and now before we arrive in, if you like, a regulatory approach through the UK government. And the other bit that I just want to emphasise in that space is that we are working across, again, international partners and coalitions to really drive take-up of the voluntary principles and to be able to monitor compliance with those voluntary principles. So there is an organisation called the We Protect Global Alliance on online child sexual abuse, which brings together NGOs, countries, tech companies to really try and recognise that, yes, regulation plays a part, and a very important part in this space, but so does international cooperation, ensuring that we are having collective discussions with the companies around how they can do more in the here and now, and making sure that there is, if you like, an international coalition of voices speaking to tech companies with one voice to make it happen. We also draw out the End Violence Against Children Coalition, which again is a partnership of NGOs who have a key role in terms of really trying to embed those approaches at country level across the globe. So we don't think the online safety bill is the whole solution, but it's a critical part of what we're trying to do in tandem with the work that we are doing internationally. And Johnny will be doing parallel work on other threats with international partners to really try and cement, as you say, recognise completely the need for coherent international action in this space.
Right. Thanks very much. There's a whole range of questions that the subject of online harms brings in, especially in the context of children. One is, of course, what is appropriate content for them to consume? Who's deciding what's appropriate, what is not? The second is, are there platforms that are building in mechanisms that are child safe in their own algorithms and in their own tech? The third is, of course, the issue of actual safety, which becomes then an issue of crime and jurisprudence as well. So there are these multiple sort of points which are connected when we talk about this. But before I go into the legality and the crime, Aparajita, maybe I can bring you in as somebody who's working with policy and advocacy. When we talk about this issue of child safety online, how are we defining what is child safety? Are we only looking at it in the prism of what is an actual, quantifiable, identifiable crime? Are we looking at the toll things are taking on mental health? Because frankly, that doesn't come under any section of any penal code, and there's no jurisprudence to kind of legislate on that. What is it that so we keep talking about creating awareness, but
Right.
what does creating awareness mean in this context?
Right, Maya. Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing this, aspect to the discussion as well. So, apart from policy and advocacy, we also run this organization called Young Leaders for Active Citizenship that works with actually young people who are using internet for advocating for a variety of causes. And we see the great things that young people also do online. So I think when we are thinking about online safety and privacy of children, it's so important not just to think about just the sort of, criminal activities that they are exposed to, but also some of these things such as mental health, addiction, etc., that we are seeing with children, which I think the UK code is also looking at, where they have actually provisions around not using nudges so that people don't keep scrolling, etc. And also a lot of focus on default settings. But also I think the other thing that always gets missed out from the discussion is protecting the agency of children online. And that is such an important aspect as well, especially in India, where a lot of first generation learners are coming online and their parents are not exposed to the internet at all. So how do we balance the privacy and safety concerns of those children who do not have that kind of parental support at home? And one of the things that maybe Maya, you can also ask the other panelists, is when we are looking at the Personal Data Protection Bill in 2019 in India, that has set the age of consent as 18. Before that, for everything, I mean, of course, it's unverifiable at that point, at this point, due to technological constraints, but parents need to give consent to children to be able to access internet. It's not enforceable, but that's what the law is trying to do. So one of the things that we also need to think about is what is that age threshold, and how do we treat children of different ages differently because they are at different levels of maturity.
Right, thanks very much, Aparajita. Rahul, let me try and bring you into this discussion, from the legal perspective before I speak to Rema and figure out what the cops are up to in this regard. But I think, I was quoting this Mott Hospital study earlier. 2-3 things that they seem to have come up with in terms of findings. One is that nearly 40% of parents who were surveyed said that it was very time consuming to monitor the social media use of their children. They were unable, 21% said they were unable to find the information required to set up parental controls, and another 32% said that children always found the means to get around these controls. So, I mean, there seems to be a whole space over there where some are trying, some are not trying enough, some are giving up because they just can't be bothered. But, who is it incumbent on? I mean, is it incumbent, legally speaking? Aparajita mentioned the age of consent in India, for example. Is it feasible for a parent to be signing off a consent form for social media for a 16-year-old, for example? Can platforms devise more kid-friendly versions of themselves, which maybe, send alerts to parents, especially if they're under the age of consent and minors under the law? Can the legal guardians be brought in a more active way? I think there are a whole bunch of questions, not to take away from children's agency, but for a country like India, we're confronted not only with the sort of, complications of technology and legality, but also, as Aparajita pointed out, the fact that you have first generation digital users, you've had kids who've been forced to study online in the last year and a half, whose parents don't know how to help.
Wow. So that's a lot to unpack in, I don't know, you've given us 2 minutes for this session. So let me try and do a little bit of it, to the extent that I can. So you're right. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult problem. This is what you call a wicked problem because it's really challenging to solve. On the one hand, we know that children below a particular age just do not have the ability or the experience to understand the things that they would need to understand in order for that consent to be meaningful. And so the way we've done it in contract law for years is to have someone who has the ability to take that decision on their behalf to step in. Why it's wicked is because in many situations, children are perhaps more tech savvy than parents, because children today are digital natives and the parents who are supervising them really have no clue about all the various things that they can do. So the statistics and what you read, which is that sometimes parents are just giving up or they just don't know how to do it, is very true. Which brings me to the sort of second question that you asked, which is whose responsibility should it be? Now, this is once again another really complicated problem, because many of the platforms are not designed to serve children. They are designed to serve the whole audience of anyone who consumes their product. I can understand that if you have a platform which is designed solely for children, that you can make it their responsibility to be more kid-friendly. But anyone can access the internet from anywhere. If you're saying that children are going to get round net nanny and all the other online protections that parents put in, it's really difficult to then expect platforms to be able to address that suggestion, which is to make it more kid friendly. And then finally, in the particular Indian context, and I don't necessarily think it's particularly Indian. I think we've got the same issues around the world. At the end of the day, the internet in the form that we're seeing it is maybe 10 years old, right? So it's anywhere in the world we are seeing these sorts of new technologies enabling new things like online learning, various other benefits like counseling, peer sort of support. These are things that are actually very valuable that children, particularly teenagers, need to benefit from. And the challenge really is to, on the one hand, allow them to get the benefits that these sort of platforms provide, but on the other hand, the thing that Christian spoke about, which is CSAM, child sexual abuse material. I mean, around the world, there is no one, no country, no person on the planet who will believe that we can allow that to happen. So how do you balance these two when literally they're all on the same platform? It's a very, very difficult task. I'll just, because Aparajita mentioned it, I just flag one last thing, which is in the Indian context. We've taken to use a very harsh binary in determining what a child is. We've used the age of majority. And the particular provisions in the Personal Data Protection Bill that apply special protections to children apply to anyone below the age of 18. Now, this, to the best of my knowledge, is an extremely aggressive view of what is a child. In many jurisdictions, it's actually a very graduated view. So up to a particular age, and I'm just going to make it up, I think Europe, US, everyone has different age groups, up to about 13, you would say that, look, that's a child that really needs protection. Or maybe you'll bring it down to 9 or 10 if you want. And then between 13 and 16, is typically the age where they need some independence, they have some ability to take their own decisions, but certainly they need some protection. And in most jurisdictions over 16, children generally are allowed to interact on the internet. And so when the Personal Data Protection Bill comes in, this very harsh binary that sets the age of consent at 18 is going to have a number of consequences that I think we haven't fully thought through, and that are going to affect many of the things that you mentioned and highlighted.
Right. In fact, that's a great sort of entry point to bring Rema into the conversation. I was saving the cops for the end, Rema. But this whole point that anybody below the age of 18 requires certain sort of guardianship, for want of a better word, to be able to act in the manner that they may want on certain platforms. That's one part of the story. But I think the bigger question and the bigger challenge is we have this argument in the case of sort of online harm on a regular basis in India, that certain things, even though they may be amplified online, can be they are criminalized under the Indian Penal Code, certain actions, and we have these conversations in the context of hate speech and violence and things like that. What happens when it comes to the issue of children? Because yes, I mean, sexual violence against a minor is a crime under the Indian Penal Code, whether it happens online or whether it happens in the real world. But who is monitoring? Who is investigating? How are you sort of making the determination that what happened online was an act of sexual violence, that children need to be protected from predators online? How is law enforcement making those judgments?
Well, thank you, Maya, and good afternoon, everyone. I must thank Team ORF yet again for this amazing opportunity to be part of this very important conversation. And also thank you for CyFy 2021 team for picking this up, because at least for India, this has a deeper impact. And I'm sure it applies to the rest of the countries also, that it has a direct impact on generations to come. So before I go on to answer your question, Maya, let me give a very brief introduction about the historical context to how things are happening in India around the child sexual abuse online and also offline. See, if you look at how the digital revolution happened in India, we have a very unique model to it. India definitely skipped the first and second industrial revolution, and we definitely skipped the third technology-driven one, because the then economic conditions were not really conducive to use of technology. We just kind of jumped right onto the really fast-paced digital technology revolution. And if you look at how things are today, we are probably at the forefront of the fourth digital revolution in India. And with almost 560 million internet users, it's really a massive volume to look at issues the way we are looking at them right now. And to answer your question, Maya, let me just quote an example from one of the last cases that I dealt with just two months ago. This was a case of child rape. By the time the case was brought to our notice, I think it was there was a lapse of 25 days. The way we got information about the case was through one of the village headmen, who gave information to the local police that there is a panchayat going on. Panchayat is something of a talk between the village headman, the community elders, and the concerned parties. So the village elders came together. They were trying to do a panchayat on an issue of a 5-year-old girl child who was raped by her own first cousin, who was a neighbor. The girl was raped brutally. She had to be hospitalized. Even in the hospital, the parents refused to divulge the information about how the whole violence happened. When the local government hospital started asking questions, they immediately took the girl child to the nearest, the unregistered medical practitioner, locally known as the RMP, registered medical practitioner. She was given a treatment, and eventually the girl died. So when we got information, we had to really put a lot of pressure on the victim's family to come to the police station to file the first information report, which is necessary to initiate legal action in India. So in this case, when we were counseling the accused, the so-called accused, who later happened to be a juvenile because he was only 16 years of age. Again, there are a lot of confusions around the age. Mr. Rahul just mentioned about the age of majority issue. It's really dicey. I think there's a lot to be done on that account also. So when we realized that the person who committed this act of violence happened to be a juvenile accused, we ended up counseling him, and that's when we came to know about the influence of technology that the boy had. The incident, this violent incident happened in a tribal hamlet. It took almost 3 hours for us to even reach to the scene of crime. It's very far. There's no proper access, not enough transportation, but every person who lives in that village had definitely access to mobile technology, just like this boy had. And the boy confessed to us that for the last 2 years he's been heavily addicted to child pornography, and he had his vivid imaginations, and he always wanted to try it on somebody. And then the immediate available victim was his own cousin, who was only 5 years of age. So he used the proximity to the child's family, gained confidence of the family, and in the absence of the parents, brings the child out, gives her a chocolate, a toffee, and then takes her to the terrace of the house and commits the rape. And when it was brought to the notice of the girl's parents, what is the first response? The girls don't want to report it to the local cops. They just want to hide it. They just want to keep it away from the cops and try to do some sort of a panchayat, some sort of a consultative process at the village level itself, so that these things are not brought to the police station. So this is the most important challenge that we face, in a social context like India. And since we are also talking about the major technology player, let me also give a little bit of my own understanding of the technology problem. You see, like we are aware that today being on social media, it's a net positive for our kids. It kind of defines their entire personality. I have a teenager at home, like Mr. Rahul rightly pointed out, we are digital natives. Sometimes it is very hard for me to do the parental control, because half of the things I don't understand. Given the kind of efforts I put in understanding technology and my line of work, it's very hard for me to understand what kind of sites my son gets into, what kind of interaction he has online. And we can clearly classify the issues that come out of the technological interaction of children online into 4. The most important issue in India, we don't really talk about it much, but at the global context, I'm sure it is a very important issue, is the body, image issue. Yeah. I have seen a lot of cases where the kids end up killing themselves because their body is not really up to the mark for them to be posting online, pictures of themselves online. And the second issue is eating disorders. Again, another issue which is really not spoken about much. The third one is definitely coping up with socialization. I really think that there is a serious issue when it comes to this generation about socialization issues. And the fourth and the most important issue is definitely online sexual abuse and other forms of violence and harm, which I'm sure we can discuss in the course of the panel. Yeah, thank you.
No, thanks, Rema, for actually, paring it down in such a sort of crystallized way as well. Jonathon, Christian, I'd like both of you to come in here, because, if the UK bill is going to be a model of sorts, or if it is intended to be a model for other countries as well to look at when they consider legislation, I mean, there are certain socio-economic, socio-cultural realities, as Rema is pointing out as well, as all our other panelists have pointed out, that make the work of any regulatory body extremely difficult. So, we get caught in the net positives of what technology does in terms of opportunity or learning, without any real sense of how to handle the negatives. And again, she raised the point of body image issues, and we saw in the US Congress just about 10 days ago, Frances Hagan talk about how people at Facebook and Instagram were aware that 30% of teenage girls using Instagram had body image issues as a result of the pressure they felt by being on the platform. So if platforms are aware internally, I mean, where are we? How will you regulate? How will a regulator be able to do their job?
Yeah, it's a great question. Should I come in first, and then Kristen, you can add anything afterwards if you want to. So in terms of how the regulator will do their job, I think you're completely right that it's going to be really challenging, given the range of harms and also the number of platforms. I think the key thing about the legislation and the way we intend to deal with that is a lot of the onus in the legislation will be put on the platforms to assess the risks that their platforms pose to their users, and to do that risk assessment themselves. So the legislation will put a duty on the platforms to carry out a risk assessment, and particularly relevant to this session, one of the duties will be in relation to what risk their platform poses to children. And that's both the risk of children being exposed to harmful content, which is both illegal content, but also content which promotes eating disorders, for example. I know Rema mentioned that, and other harmful content such as pornography, which I know has also been mentioned. So the platform will need to assess what risk there is of the children coming across that kind of content, and also what risk there is that their design will promote such content and increase the likelihood of children being exposed to that content. And then, based on the risk the platform themselves identified, they'll then need to identify mitigations that they're going to put in place to address that risk and to minimise the chance of children being exposed to such harmful content. And then the role of the regulator there will be to oversee both the risk assessment process to make sure they're comfortable that it's robust enough and that it's accurate, and also to oversee the mitigations to make sure they're confident they're sufficient. And over time, if the regulator feels that the risk assessment process isn't being done well enough, or the mitigations aren't actually addressing the problem, that's when the regulator would step in and take action where it's needed and where it's necessary and proportionate. So I think we do recognise that it's a really challenging situation, and this is a hard sector to regulate, and this is probably one of the first pieces of legislation that's actually trying to do it. But the way we try and get around that is by putting the duty on the platforms and then putting the onus on them to assess their risk and come up with their mitigations.
Okay, I know Aparajita and Christian both want to come in on this. So Christian, maybe you can follow up, and then I'll come back to Aparajita.
I mean, just to add, I was just interested in the discussion that was happening before, particularly around age. And so again, the regulatory framework will recognise, as Johnny says, put the onus for what we are calling legal but harmful material on the company actually taking steps that is in line with its terms and conditions. So if it has terms and conditions of service that say, for example, you have to be 13 to access your platform, what are you doing to assure yourself as a platform around what you know about the age of your users and how far you are meeting your own terms and conditions? So I guess it's just trying to do, we're looking at work within the UK in terms of what we would call age assurance technologies. What can companies do to satisfy themselves around the age of their users, and therefore whether the mitigations and safety measures they have in place are proportionate. There's a further discussion around age verification, particularly as it applies to children's access to adult material, particularly pornography. And age assurance and age verification, two slightly different things, but again, trying to ensure that the framework itself, the regulatory framework, puts the onus on the companies themselves to judge how far they are complying with their terms and conditions, which then allows the regulator to effectively take action and say, well, hang on, your terms and conditions say X, your actions are completely out with what your terms and conditions say. Therefore, there is then the escalating issue of sanctions that can be deployed. I also just wanted to do two other things very quickly, and then I'll be quiet. First of all, the issue around data protection issues in this space. So just to point out that within the UK, there is something called the Age Appropriate Design Code, which has recently been published by the Information Commissioner's Office, which again sets out the expectations on companies around the design principles that need to embed in order to protect child safety. And again, these are tools and options for the regulator to use in terms of how far it can hold companies to account. And the last bit, sorry, just a very quick plug to pick up some of the issues that were talked about earlier. I mentioned the We Protect Global Alliance earlier, a big international organisation to bring together communities to discuss solutions to tackling online child sexual abuse. Worth noting that only today it's published its global threat assessment. So it has set out fairly comprehensively what the risk to children looks like from child sexual abuse material to help inform countries' approaches. And they've also published previously what they call a model national response, which sets out how can countries and other actors take action to ensure that they are taking action in line with the global threat assessment. So I just wanted to point out that there are useful tools here. This is difficult, this is complicated, but there are partnerships that are trying to support a global effort to help countries to try and wrestle with some of these challenges.
Right, okay. Before I carry on, Aparajita, but you want to make your comment as well, and then I'll come to Rahul for a quick question as well.
Right. Thank you so much. I just wanted to build on what Jonathon and Christian just spoke about. I think the risk assessment part is really important, and I'm glad that UK has made that mandatory, because I think a lot of companies are doing risk assessments, but they are not transparent about it. And although they might be acting on it, when we have situations like they got leaked, then it becomes something which is a disincentive for companies to even do that risk assessment. So by making it a regulatory filing, I think it provides the right incentive for the companies to be transparent about it and have it in public domain, so that a public discussion can happen. The second point that I wanted to make is, I think there's a lot of focus on what regulators can do. But I think the missing conversation is how can we also empower children to make better decisions for them online. Just as we have good touch and bad touch workshops for children to counter abuse and to be able to understand what physical abuse is, we also need to empower our children to have good digital habits. And I think so at WILAC, what we are doing is we are actually running digital citizenship curriculums in tier 2, tier 3 cities, and we just started piloting it this year, which starts from security, privacy, and it goes up to how you can use internet for growth and generally building communities. And the idea is to tell children how platforms actually work. Let them know that platform design is something that is also guiding your actions, and you need to be conscious of the thing that people post only good things about their life online, photos are heavily edited. Those kind of things also need to be told to the children themselves. And I think the third point that Christian mentioned, the design code, I think that's a very interesting development for policymakers across the world. Even in the PDP bill 2019, we have privacy by design concept that the sort of government has sort of floated. And I think definitely Indian policymakers would be looking at it very closely and have some of those privacy by design principles as a part of the codes, etc., that get issued by the Data Protection Authority.
Let me just come back to you, Rema, very quickly before I move on, because I know that you have been working on, in maybe in a different context in terms of misinformation or whatever it is, but you have been working on creating digital literacy awareness at the local level, the village level, the tehsil level, the town level. I mean, in your career as a police officer for the last few years. So Aparajita is talking about empowering the children. You empower them with awareness. But I mean, from the ground, in your experience, when you're creating these modules for literacy or creating these camps for awareness, where have the stumbling blocks been? Because you actually need to also make not just the children aware, but also their parents. I mean, we're looking at surveys in the US today where children are getting digital literacy in schools, but parents are saying, we can't handle this. So we're kind of at a crossroads here, aren't we? You're on mute, Rema.
I said, thank you, Maya, for bringing that up. Well, I think the most, difficult part of having to run these community outreach campaigns in Indian villages is to bring all the stakeholders together. It's really hard to bring everybody on board and convince them that this is for a cause which will have a longer impact on the children, and to finally make sure that these efforts are streamlined into the system. While I am serving as the district police chief of a particular district, I initiate a particular campaign, and the campaign runs its full course, and the moment I'm transferred out, it stops. So that kind of continuity issue is one of the major challenges that we face. And the second thing, Maya just mentioned.
Oh, I think we may have lost Rema's connection. Hopefully, she'll come back. Rahul, just, this idea of empowering and what Christian was talking about, platforms adhering to terms and conditions that they have laid out, because, I mean, that's possibly the one big black hole for all of us who are so tied to the internet today. We have no, if we're using certain apps, if we don't want to be Luddites and live in a pre-digital age, we have no choice but to accept terms and conditions, whether it is for your Apple computer or using Microsoft Word or using, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram or what have you. So we're kind of locked into this system without many choices. That choice has been, the agency to make that choice, in a sense, has been taken away from the consumer. So given that, how can you empower children?
Look, yeah, I mean, I think empowering children is probably a very dynamic thing that you have to think about in the specific context that you're applying it. I mean, obviously, we want to empower children to take the decisions themselves, because we recognize that it's really difficult for all these various reasons. For, on the one hand, parents to do it effectively, on the other hand, for regulators to do it in a way that ensures that everyone is adequately protected, and finally, even for the platforms beyond the point to ensure that everyone is protected. I think the solution really is a combination of all of these things, and I think a lot of the things that have been mentioned in the course of this conversation are really important. I think we've got to look at privacy by design. We've got to where you've got the option, where you've got the design choice, choose the design choice that assumes that a child is looking at it, or that if a child looks at it, a child could be confused and go in a direction that they shouldn't. And if you're spending the R&D dollars on building these powerful attention machines that once you get onto them, you suddenly it's 2 hours have passed and you're still scrolling through this never-ending feed. Surely you can turn some of that energy and R&D skill into building things that are by design going to protect children. I think it's a combination of all of these things that will actually empower children. The other thing I want to point out is that, look, I don't want to belittle it in any way, but these are issues that we have faced in the offline world before this. I don't know if it was going to show my age, but Twiggy, the model in the UK, created body issues because she was pencil thin, and everyone wanted to just become anorexic, and you've got that whole, including many celebrities and anorexia and bulimia, and all of these things are not new diseases, and so body issues have always been around. What's different? And that's why I really like that story that Rema mentioned, which is in a village that it takes you 3 hours to get to, the internet reaches them. And that's the particular challenge that we have, which is that it is today, it reaches places that otherwise it would not have reached. It reaches places at a speed that was previously unthinkable. And so we've got to redesign the way in which we regulate to match the speed of the internet. And that's not a trivial, that's not an easy thing to do. So I would say that it's very difficult to be prescriptive. I think if anything, what everyone has said is that these are very challenging, difficult problems. I believe that we've got to be very agile. And in that, let me just say the thing that I've said many, many times. We started writing this data protection bill 10 years ago. It's 2021, almost the end of 2021. We still don't have a data protection law in this country. That's not the speed of the internet. And we've got to learn how to regulate this space really quickly. And it's well worth the time on an organization, on a platform such as this, to discuss agile tech regulation as the way to solve many of these problems.
Right. I think that's an important point. I mean, we need to keep pace as much as possible, I suppose, with technology and technological advancement in the context of the internet and the way we consume. I mean, you're absolutely right that it's taken 10 years of discussion and we haven't even got there. Christian, I mean, you know, the UK and the online harms bill, that's also been an ongoing conversation actually. I mean, you know, when Ofcom came up, it was seen as, oh, okay, somebody else is doing it, so maybe we have a model to emulate globally there as well. But, you know, final comments from you on this. How difficult do you think it's going to be for you to implement this bill once it is enacted? Where will the challenges and the struggles come from primarily? I mean, you must be doing some sort of crystal gazing on that.
So I just want to make a couple of points very quickly and then I'll let Johnny come in on the wider bill issue. First of all, regulation. Again, as you say, this has been a long journey for the UK. You know, the online safety bill has been a long time in gestation. The key bit for me, though, and this is important not to lose sight of, is the process itself of going through establishing a regulatory regime.
Yeah. We lost Christian.
Should I quickly come in?
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. Why don't you finish up, because we need to wrap the discussion anyway. So, yeah.
I was just going to make the point. You made the point about it going to be difficult to implement, and I think you're right. It's going to be an ongoing challenge. Particularly, I think the key is building up Ofcom as the regulator with sufficient expertise and a knowledge of the tech sector and understanding how it evolves over time, because obviously the internet doesn't stay still, as we've said a number of times in this discussion. It keeps on evolving. So yeah. I think building up that expertise in Ofcom and making sure that they're staying on top of how the internet evolves and their codes of practice continue to reflect that, so that the kind of expectations on companies continues to evolve is going to be really important. And I know we've started work on that already, and Ofcom is already building that expertise, and I think that'll be an ongoing process which will take a couple of years.
Great. Thanks a lot. I think we're completely out of time. I'm getting messages to wrap up the discussion. As I expected, 45 minutes was not going to be enough, but that's all we have time for. We should take this conversation offline perhaps and continue engaging on it there. But thank you all very much for being part of this panel discussion for CyFy 2021 on this very important issue of keeping children safe online. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you.